thank you for hosting me and my family for Shabbat. I thank also Rabbi Mike, who has been a wonderful friend. And I have to tell you that when I first came here, which was 2 years ago for this breakfast, actually, I went away thinking, wow, I didn't know who you were. And then I found out, and I thought, wow, these are my people. And ever since then, I was thinking, this is where I want to live.
Plenty of realtors in town.
And I really thought that. I was thinking, how the kids will grow up, go away, we'll move here, Okay. What? Yeah.
Retired taxi.
Retired taxi. Yeah. So thank you, and thank you for restoring my hope and showing me what a wonderful Jewish community actually can be. And there are many things that I admire in addition to your politics. I admire your rabbi, and I admire your cantor. You have a wonderful rabbi and a wonderful cantor. And what I love about both of them is their honesty, straightforwardness. There's no pretentiousness that I have often found among some rabbis. So you're very fortunate. I love the way your cantor led the davening. She has a beautiful voice, and she has a voice that you can immediately join in, and that's special too. She doesn't perform, she brings you in. So I thank you. I'm talking today about my father and Martin Luther King. And what I want to begin by suggesting is something that I would bring up in a modern Jewish history class. Is everybody hear me okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, one of the ways in which we open a course on modern Jewish history is by talking about Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin, great German Jewish philosopher. He was from a small village, Dessau, and he came to Berlin because his teacher, his rabbi, was moving to Berlin. At that time, a Jew needed special permission to live in Berlin in the late 18th century. He received that permission. He was a brilliant philosopher. Of course, he did his writing, somewhat in isolation. That is, if a Jew wrote, it wasn't common to have a circle of Christian intellectual friends. However, Mendelssohn's work was so renowned and really respected by the academic world, the intellectual world in those days, and by the way, there was still no university in Berlin at the time, that Christians actually sought him out and became friends with him. There's a famous painting that shows Moses Mendelssohn sitting with a Christian friend, theologian, playing chess at the table. And the point of it is that in the 18th century, all over Europe, people were astonished, both Jews and Christians, that such a friendship could even exist between a Jew and a Christian. It was considered remarkable and a breakthrough. People celebrated it. When Mendelssohn died, thousands of people went through the streets following his coffin. The shops were closed, and these weren't Jews, the Jews and Christians. So there was something about it that was inspiring. There's certain kinds of friendships where you break through conventional boundaries and create something new, something inspiring. And that friendship and that inspiration, by the way, lasted through the 19th century. Mendelssohn and his friend Lessing. Something is similarly true of my father's relationship with Martin Luther King. We can ask why. Why is it so important, so meaningful to so many people? But I want to tell you that my father had friends with lots of different kinds of people. Lots of Jews and Christians. But since he died, one group that has remained to this day immensely grateful to him has been the group of his civil rights African American colleagues and friends, the people in that circle. Second to that would be Catholics, Catholic theologians who were inspired by my father, priests and nuns, monks who read his work for personal religious inspiration. And that's pretty amazing. And I'll come back to that. But more than the Jews, the civil rights leaders, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, Reverend C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, so many of these figures. And I think in the Jewish world also, there's a sense of pride in my father's friendship with Martin Luther King and in the picture of Selma. Now, I want to just, so this is a picture, as you know, of my father. What sort of sets the stage for this is page 1 of a book of my father's. The book is called God in Search of Man. And the book opens, it's a philosophy of Judaism. But the book opens, not like most philosophies, which say and try to prove the existence of God or some such thing. Instead, the book opens by saying it's customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. And notice, by the way, this is like the first heresy that Nachman of Bratslav talks about. People who come and argue based on science and philosophy. Okay, yeah, that's what we're used to. But then he says it would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. How is it insipid? When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, which I think is a wonderful phrase. When religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion. Authority versus compassion. And you can hear a little bit of Nachman of Bratslav there.
Yeah.
Its message, when that happens, its message becomes meaningless. And I'll just mention, it says when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain. In another book, a book that he published just before that, Man is Not Alone, my father writes something that he actually got from another Hasidic Rebbe, the Kotzker Rebbe. The Kotzker Rebbe said, your Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. And if you don't know who you are, then how can your Judaism be authentic? And it was very important to my father. Yes, in fact, you have to know who you are. And he spends a lot of time in this book, God in Search of Man, and in Man is Not Alone, talking about experiences that people have that tend to be neglected by us. Experiences like wonder and awe, radical amazement. Who talks about that? And he talks about those words, it goes on, glory. He talks about this because in fact he says that's what religion is about. And religion should not be explained in terms of other fields, whether it's psychology or sociology or philosophy. Fine, those are different fields, but let religion speak in its own terms. And then you see what religion is about. Wonder, awe. So the Kotzker says, religion, your Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. And my father says in Man is Not Alone, to be Jewish like somebody else, like your grandparents, for example, that would be spiritual plagiarism. Isn't that great? And I hope you can see also with that, and I'm glad you laughed because my father had a great sense of humor. And he has also a note of irony in his work, just like the prophets can be ironic. Yeah. But yes, of course, you want to be Jewish like your grandparents and put on a black hat and a long cap. It's very striking. People want to do that. They feel a kind of nostalgia, but that's not authentic to who they are. And for the Kotzker, that would be awful. He would reject it totally. So who are you? That's the first question. But then there's the issue, he says here, irrelevant, dull, insipid. Irrelevant, dull, insipid. So the issue is, for my father, people say, oh, he broke with Hasidism, which is not true, because his works are permeated with Hasidic ideas. But he said over and over again, I asked myself, what does the world need from me? What does the world need from me today? What can I do? And that was his question. And how can I respond to that need? So, I mentioned to you in my talk last night briefly that the German Protestant theologians had no interest in the prophets. For my father, the prophets were central. But the question is, what does it mean to be a prophet? For the German Protestants, a prophet was someone who lost consciousness, who was maybe mentally ill, who was writhing on the ground, who didn't even know what he was saying. My father says, what manner of man is the prophet? The prophet is a person of agony, whose life and soul are at stake in what he says, yet who is able to perceive the silent sigh of human anguish. Because he said, my father said over and over again, there are people suffering, and we don't hear them. Of course we don't, because we live in gated communities. We don't even see what's going on. It's far away. Maybe we read it in a newspaper, and we hear horrible things. But of course, we're upset. But for how long? We're horrified that the United States has these concentration camps. And by the way, there's a very interesting book that came out last year by a woman named Andrea Pitzer. And I forgot the exact title, but Andrea Pitzer, it's about concentration camps, the concentration camp century. You know the book? It's an excellent book. And how do we react as Jews? Jews started screaming, how dare you compare? That's not the way to react. Yeah? So there is a silent sigh of human anguish. My father used to say that also about synagogue services and how complacent. I had a student who came to me once. She said her mother is Christian, her father is Jewish, and they raised her. They said you could go to synagogue, go to church, doesn't matter, you choose. And she said, you know, I go to synagogues, I go to churches, and I hear the same thing. The family is very important. That's what they say. Family is important. Who's against that? Nobody. Everybody wants family. Okay. It has no challenge to it. And my father used to say, you know, in the synagogue, remember, there are people in deep anguish. There are people who've been through something terrible. And that has to be reflected. So, the prophet is a person of agony. God is raging in the prophet's words. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. And ultimately he said, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. He didn't say everybody should be a prophet because he thought a prophet is something quite extraordinary. But he said we should stand in the prophetic tradition. And he argued that the prophetic tradition is not limited to the Bible. The prophetic tradition is also in rabbinic literature, in the medieval tradition, and in the modern tradition, especially in Hasidism. And one of the things that my father did that was innovative in his thinking was the following. For Hasidism, I told you yesterday, you say the Shem Yichud Kuchbrichu Shrinte before you say a prayer. That is, for the sake of the redemption of God, of bringing together the male and female, the transcendent and the immanent aspects of God. They should be brought together, and God should also be redeemed with us. And may my prayer help achieve that. And that's Hasidic thought. That is, Hasidic thought focuses on your religious actions, prayer, making Kiddush. My father said it should also apply to the commandments in Judaism, Jewish law, that have to do with how we treat other human beings. Like, as I mentioned, Gzela de Malchuta, like when the sovereign does something illegal. Like my father said, why do we only have a mashgiach in the restaurants and the butcher store? Why not also in the banks and the businesses? Because there is Jewish law to follow there as well, of honesty and decency. So it's not that we don't have the law, it's that we don't apply it. Actually, I'm going to... Now, some people say...
Dr. Heschel, we'll have someone help you with the slides while you're talking, so you don't have to go for it.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, I can look and see what's
It's an exercise.
So, there are people who say that my father first became active in political work in the 1960s. It's not really true. Already when he was living in Nazi Germany, he was speaking to groups, for example, the Quakers in Frankfurt, And he was speaking, of course, giving lectures to the Jewish community in Germany. He was there from 1927 until October of 38, when all the Polish Jews were deported to Poland. So in the 1940s, when he was in the United States during World War II, he participated in the March of the Rabbis in Washington, D.C., for example. My father was born, by the way, in 1907, just to give you a sense. He was then in his 30s. And then at the end of the war, he started writing about Auschwitz and Hiroshima. And I just ask you, sometime take a look at writings from that period of time, from the late 40s and the 50s and the 60s. How many Jews say Auschwitz and Hiroshima? Yeah. All right. So he became an important voice in America, in part thanks to Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian, who wrote a review of the book Man Is Not Alone that appeared in the New York Herald Tribune on a Sunday. And that day, it was before I was born, that day my parents were very excited and thrilled that Reinhold Niebuhr would write about my father's book, a wonderful review. And they thought their friends would call and family and say Mazel Tov. The phone didn't ring all day. And they told me, never become an academic. But during the course of the 50s, my father was asked to give public lectures for Jewish groups, but also for things like the White House Conference on Children and Youth, the White House Conference on Aging, and so forth. Public lectures. He became a Jewish voice. And in 1963, there was a conference held in Chicago on religion and race. And my father and Dr. King were both invited to give keynote speeches at that conference. By the way, no women were invited to speak. Yeah. And at that conference, my father gave a very stirring speech. And he opened it with this passage. He said, at the first conference on religion and race, and he said, by the way, these are two words that should never be spoken in the same breath because they're diametrically opposed. But at the first conference, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me. While Pharaoh retorted, who is the Lord that I should heed his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. The speech was very stirring, and what was especially remarkable, and these are just a few other passages from that speech, my father met Dr. King in that moment, and they, as we say these days, they bonded. Both of them, of course, transformed the present moment into biblical time. Both of them evoked the Exodus, the prophets. And I just want you to keep in mind how extraordinary it was for my father, coming from Nazi Germany, where Christians were saying the Old Testament has no place in the Christian Bible because it's Jewish, and saying that Jesus was an Aryan, not a Jew. And then he comes to this country and he meets someone like Reinhold Niebuhr, for whom the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, is very important. And for most Christian theologians, actually, in America, and certainly within the black church. And my father said, if there's any hope for the future of Judaism in America, it lies with the black church, because that's where real prayer is happening. So the evocation for my father to see that Dr. King made the Hebrew Bible something central in the American story, that was extraordinary. I don't know, I think that the letters might be too small. Should I just read it? Or can you see it?
Yes. See it.
You can see it?
No.
No, okay.
It's nice to hear your voice.
Okay. Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal and evil racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking. Racism is an eye disease, a cancer of the soul. The problem is how to stop the profanation of God's name by dishonoring African Americans. Racism is an evil of tremendous power, but God's will transcends all powers. To surrender to despair is to surrender to evil. It is important to feel anxiety, it is sinful to wallow in despair. And this, I think, is a great line. Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. Unmitigated evil. Now this speech is very powerful, and Cornel West, who's a friend and colleague at Dartmouth, said that this speech, he thinks, is the strongest condemnation of racism by a white person since William Garrison in the 19th century. It's a very powerful speech. And James Cone, late James Cone, who was a professor at Union Seminary, pointed something out that I think is interesting. This speech is full of passion, it's full of emotion. He compared it to other speeches given by white theologians at the time, even Reinhold Niebuhr, great thinker, who was very dry in his condemnation. The passion wasn't there. And one question is, where does that passion come from in my father's voice? Niebuhr's voice changed after he became friends with James Baldwin. My father didn't know James Baldwin. He taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. There were no colleagues there who were black, no students. He didn't have friends in that community at all. But his voice was a voice of passion. And I think that's an important lesson for us. It doesn't have to come through our personal life, our personal experience, and nonetheless we can be passionate when we speak our principles. So my father met Dr. King at that time. They became very close all of a sudden. Dr. King had a personal lawyer named Clarence Jones, who is still alive, who was wonderful. And he told me that every time they would have a meeting to plan some event, Dr. King would say, somebody call Rabbi Heschel and see if he's available, which I think is very sweet. But I'll show you now the next step. You remember the March on Washington in August of 1963. President Kennedy was not happy about that. He didn't want it to happen. And so he called a meeting of civil rights leaders to try to convince them not to do it. And my father was one of those invited, and he responded with a telegram. You remember what a telegram is? Well, this is a picture.
Yesterday's tweets.
Yeah. And here's the text. So this is telegram language. This is from June of 1963. I look forward to privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow 4 p.m. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church, synagogue have failed, they must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. A Marshall Plan is on, and then he says, the hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. Yeah, and what's interesting here is also the phrase, state of moral emergency. You know, the state of emergency, when presidents or when sovereigns call, what they mean is martial law. That means suspend rights. That's what a state of emergency, you know, that's what a fascist dictator does, an authoritarian leader. State of emergency. Please God, it shouldn't happen here. But here he says moral emergency. And you know, if you think about it, what does that mean? Call for a state of moral emergency. We have a state right now of medical emergency with the WHO called, right? Because of the coronavirus. And then he says the hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity, which I think is such an amazing phrase. And I use that as the title of a book of his essays that I edited. So the friendship between my father and Dr. King, also in that spring of '63, just a few months later, they started lecturing together. They gave a talk together to Jewish groups, the United Synagogue of America, which is conservative Jews. They had a convention in the Catskills at the Concord Hotel, which you may remember. And they both gave talks. And when they would give a talk, they talked about race. They talked about freeing Soviet Jews. They talked about Israel. They talked about all kinds of issues together. But they spoke together on the same platform. And they did that over and over again over the course of the years. Now, when Dr. King would be offered an award by a Jewish organization, my father was often asked to present the award to him, for instance. When my father presented that picture was an award, he introduced Dr. King, and I just want to give you a taste of that. He said, "The glory of God is concealed, yet there are moments in which it is revealed." And you know this is in the Bible. God's glory is revealed. What is the nature of the glory? Moses asked God, "Show me, I pray thee, thy glory." And his petition was granted. The Lord, God, merciful and gracious, abundant in goodness and truth. The glory of God is concealed, yet there are moments in which it is revealed. We sense a glimpse of the glory in the life of Martin Luther King, and we honor him because his words and his deeds are a marvelous glorification of God, who is merciful and gracious. Sacred and magnificent is the work he does for all of us in America. At the same time, the scope of God's glory is the whole world, all of humanity. And you know this phrase is in our liturgy, Adonai, Adonai, Arachum V'chanun. Yeah. So Martin Luther King is a glimpse of God's glory, and at the same time a glorification of God. What made him a glimpse of God's glory? He was so inspiring. When I heard Dr. King speak, I was deeply moved. He touched my heart. And it's hard to find someone who touches your heart, to be moved by another person. And you think sometimes, I wonder sometimes, what is it that makes somebody deeply moving in that way that he did? And the glorification of God. How do we glorify God? That's a question. I think there was something transformative to be able to move people. That is, to take the hardened hearts of Americans and move them and change them and soften them. That was extraordinary. I watched some of the old clips of Dr. King being interviewed on programs like Meet the Press, Face the Nation, things like that, and they would ask him sometimes really obnoxious questions. And I just watched him, and he would pause, and you could see it was stressful, it's hard, and he would pause and he would give them a calm answer. He didn't allow them to change him. And you know, in the civil rights movement, the idea of nonviolent resistance and the training that happened at the Highlander School in Tennessee was not only that you wouldn't fight back with your fists, but that you wouldn't respond with anger in your heart. And that's what I find extraordinary. When I think of the example of John Lewis, who was beaten at the Pettus Bridge leaving Selma, and yet he could have easily been furious. He couldn't fight back against the Alabama state troopers. You know the Pettus Bridge is curved, so they didn't even know it was until they got to the crest of the bridge, and then they were charged. And there he was, his skull was fractured. But I find that so remarkable that he didn't look for revenge, that he didn't look for anger, that he behaved to this day with so much dignity, and his response was, how can I make this a better world? You know, there's a phrase in his autobiography, Walking with the Wind is the name of his book, and he says, in Africa there is a saying, when you pray, move your feet. My father said after Selma, I felt my legs were praying. And I was struck by those two phrases. So, not to be resentful, and I think that's especially important. Often people will say the reason Germans became Nazis was because of World War I, the defeat, the humiliation, the forcible reparations they had to pay that the Allies imposed on them. So, of course, they were resentful. So, of course, they would become Nazis and want to kill people. No, actually, no. And maybe part of it is that the theologians, who were in fact very prominent figures in German culture, it was a church-going culture, that they didn't show them that there is another way. That the way of the prophets is, yes, you can be indignant, but it's indignant at injustice that does not lead you to resentment, to revenge, to rage. On the contrary, to try to live a better life, to remember who you are and what you stand for. And so that's what I found among the many things extraordinary about the civil rights movement. So, one of the marchers who was a pastor in Hawaii was the brother of a senator from Hawaii, a U.S. senator, and came to the march in Selma with Lays and gave it to some of the marchers in the front. It was actually Andrew Young who organized everybody. He's so wonderful, Andrew Young. He's so warm and wonderful. It's amazing. And sweet and funny. Such a nice person who tried so hard. Yeah. And he organized the marchers, and there they were. There's Reverend Abernathy and Dr. King and Ralph Bunch and my father. And that's at the beginning of the march. They were at a service. I'll just tell you that my father and Dr. King and a few others spent the night before the march at the home of Dr. Sullivan Jackson in Selma. Dr. Jackson was an African-American dentist in the community. His wife was a school teacher, and they had a little girl. And Dr. King lived with them for several months during the Selma campaign. And their daughter, Joanna, who's now grown up, of course, preserved the house and the furniture. And we visited. We met the mother, who since the parents have passed away, and Joanna let us sleep in the bed where Dr. King slept, which is great. And that house is very special to me. And I just want to say that one of the things that I would urge you to do, to think about doing, is to take a synagogue trip to Selma for the weekend. There's a synagogue there. It's very small, but very lovely. And some synagogues around the country have been doing that, and youth groups too, teenage groups. So they stayed, and Mrs. Jackson told me that the morning of the march, when she woke up and she went into the living room, she saw something remarkable. It was quiet. In one corner of the room, Dr. King was standing and saying his prayers. In another corner of the room, there was my father saying his prayers. And somewhere else, it was Andrew Young. There were people in different corners of the house. Everybody was praying. And I thought that was extraordinary. And I urge you to go there. There's much to see in Selma. There's a museum with photographs and so on. Try to go to this home and imagine what that was like. And it was an amazing thing about the civil rights movement, that it could create a place, a space, a living room, where people of different faiths, each praying in their own quiet way prior to this march. Yeah. I'm sorry that the film Selma didn't include that. The film had recreated the house, and had Mrs. Jackson making breakfast. It's so banal, and I miss that. All right, so I'll show you a few pictures from the Selma March. I just want to point out that this image was given to me by a news photographer in Mobile. If you see in the upper corner here, it says Tepper's. Tepper's is the name of a department store that was owned by a Jew who was very active in the segregationist movement, in the anti-civil rights movement, a very prominent and very loud figure in Selma. So let's keep in mind, yes, not all Jews were with Dr. King. And you can read about him in a book by Clive Webb if you're interested. So here they are moving out of the downtown area. So I think having Tepper's in the background is important. And here's again another picture. This is probably the most famous picture. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry, your father.
So this may be the most famous photograph of that march. I think it was taken by UPI, United Press International. And the thing is, and you can see John Lewis at the far end, and next to him is a nun who is, I believe, one of the sisters who came from Kansas City, Missouri to the march. A whole group of nuns, a whole convent came to Selma. But I think it's important to keep in mind, for example, that this was a very tense time. Can you see, is it okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah. This is a tense time. People were being killed in Selma, beaten. It was frightening. When my father left, first of all, the telegram came on a Friday afternoon to come to the march. And it was always a nervous Shabbat. My father had quickly made a plane reservation and packed a suitcase before Shabbat, and then things were anxious in our home. And then it was time for Havdalah. My father made Havdalah, and then my mother and I went down the elevator with him. And he kissed me goodbye. And I clung to that moment and to that kiss because I didn't know if he'd come back. And he went into the taxi and went away. And we were scared because there had been violence. The South was violent. At the same time, he gave me the feeling that this was the most important thing a person could be doing right now. I can tell you that he was alone. His colleagues at the seminary where he taught, nobody was interested. In my school in New York City, the other kids weren't paying attention. It wasn't an issue. It was lonely and it was scary. So the Alabama state troopers, and you see it's called Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was a Confederate general. The Alabama state troopers took tens of thousands of photographs of the civil rights movement. And they're preserved and now they're shown in a museum in Selma. And again, I urge you to go and take a look. You can't see all of them, but what you see is quite fascinating and dramatic. Now, in their meetings, my father and Dr. King, one of the issues that came up was, of course, the war in Vietnam. The year 1965 was a very important year for my father. This march, the Selma and Montgomery March, was in the month of March, 1965. That summer, we went to Israel for 2 months. My father was invited as a guest of the president, Zalman Shazar, who was actually a childhood friend of my father's from Warsaw. And President Shazar wanted my father to give lectures around the country because he had the feeling that the Israeli young people were losing a sense of what it is to be Jewish. So we spent the summer, those 2 months, in Israel, and my father traveled the country and lectured. That fall, when we came back, my father was a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary. The first time a Jew was teaching as a professor at that Protestant seminary, which was right across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary. They had to actually change the constitution of the seminary in order to have a Jew teach there. So he was teaching there, and at the same time, there was the culmination of something my father had worked on for several years, which was the Second Vatican Council statement about relations between the Catholic Church and Jews. My father was the delegate representing the Jewish community. going to Rome back and forth quite a few times. He met with the Pope. And as you probably know, the first statement that was issued, a draft, was okay. The second one was horrible. My father objected to the idea of Christians trying to convert Jews. That, he said, was spiritual fratricide. Unacceptable. So no more conversion. And that was a sticky point, because at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, in this chapter 27, which some scholars believe is a later interpolation, there is what's called the Great Mission. Jesus tells his disciples, go out and convert everybody, so to speak. So to abandon that effort to convert would be, in some sense, to abandon the New Testament for Christians. So how could they do that? So it was very touchy, and there were political issues involved with bishops from Arab countries and African countries, Asian countries, who also thought, who cares about Jews? That's not an issue. What anti-Semitism wasn't part of their agenda at all. But the final version that came out, Nostra Aetate, that final version reflected my father's influence and was almost entirely what he did want. And that was issued in October of 1965. In that same month, my father founded an organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And the opening meeting was held in Manhattan, and I was there. The Berrigan brothers, the priests, were supposed to be there, and their superiors in the church didn't want them and sent them away out of the country. So they had an empty chair for them, representing them. William Sloane Coffin, who was then chaplain at Yale University, was one of the people involved in this, the leaders. Another person was John Bennett, the president of Union Theological Seminary. So it was quite a distinguished crowd that came. Another was Richard John Newhouse, who later became, he was then Lutheran, he became Catholic, and the editor of the journal First Things. He became radically right-wing, actually, after a while. But they founded this organization in October. In November, the next month, my father gave his inaugural address at Union Seminary called No Religion is an Island. All of this time, this was the concern. Vietnam. We weren't achieving military or political goals, but we were committing war crimes. And the question was whether Dr. King should speak out against the war. And the issue was this: if he did so, he would alienate the president and he would alienate Congress and he might weaken the civil rights movement. What should be done? For my father and my parents' table, and this was a discussion over and over again, it was a moral issue. And a moral issue whether my father should encourage Dr. King to speak out against the war. What is our moral responsibility? So, on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King gave a major address at Riverside Church against the war in Vietnam. My father introduced him on that occasion, and there's going to be a memorial of that event this coming April, by the way, at Riverside Church on April 5th, in case you're in New York. Riverside Church event was followed by demonstrations. This is Arlington National Cemetery. My father and Dr. King wanted to have a demonstration. The government said no, so they said, well, can we have a prayer service? And the government said, yes, but you could each only speak for 1 minute. Pray for 1 minute, that's it. Maurice Eisendorf brought a Sefer Torah. And the people there carried a small flag. And my father quoted a psalm, Eli, Eli, lama azabtani, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's the same psalm that Jesus quoted on the cross. And these are just a few other photographs. Whoops. Again in Arlington. This is with Dr. Spock, who also opposed war. This was Riverside Church. And the final thing I will tell you about is a meeting at the Concord Hotel in 1968, just before, 10 days before Dr. King was assassinated, and then I'll stop. It was a convention of conservative rabbis. And they were celebrating my father's birthday, and they asked Dr. King to give the keynote. That's, by the way, Rabbi Everett Gendler sitting. Yeah. When I was there was dinner, and after dinner, we all went into the auditorium. And there were just hundreds and hundreds of rabbis present, all, of course, men in those days, with their wives. And when Dr. King came into the room, everybody stood up and linked arms, because this is how we did it in those days, and we sang "We Shall Overcome" in Hebrew.
Wow.
And that was amazing.
Wow.
And Dr. King said, "I've been all over the world, and I've heard 'We Shall Overcome' in so many languages, but this is the first time in Hebrew." And it was a wonderful occasion. I'll tell you that Dr. King gave me an important lesson. At the end of this evening, it was late, and everybody was tired, and my father and Dr. King wanted to talk privately, and there I was, a kid. My father took me over to Dr. King and said, "Do you remember Susie?" Which is what I was called. And Dr. King, even though it must have been, 11 at night, he was tired, a long day, etc., etc., I had met him a few times, but of course, I was a nothing. I was just a kid, nobody. And he could have just said, "Oh, yes, yes." But instead, he said, "Of course I remember Susie." And I thought that was wonderful. And I remember that when I'm tired and kind of irritable and annoyed, and I just want to go to bed, and somebody wants something from me. And I remember how Dr. King, even in that moment, gave me that gift, that kindness to say that to me. And he turned to one of his assistants who was with him, and he said, "Maybe you can show Susie our offices in the hotel while I talk to her father." Mm-hmm. So his assistant was sort of my babysitter while and again, did he have to do that? No. And it was that moment of kindness that has stayed with me, that he was able to do that even in such a busy moment. So I just have a few other photographs here, and I'll end with Jesse Jackson at the Democratic National Convention, who once said something wasn't so, he said that he referred to New York City as Town.
Yeah.
So what? And then everybody's upset, and he apologized. You tell me when someone has said something offensive to or about Jews, who has then apologized in the course of 2,000 years of Jewish history. No, he apologized once, twice, 3 times, over and over again. And people to this day will say to me, "Oh, he's anti-Semitic." And a friend of mine said to me, "Why won't the Jews accept his apology?" That's a good question. And he said, Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King are calling out to us from their graves for reconciliation. So that friendship inspired a great deal. These last 2 photographs, this was Memphis, the day after Dr. King was assassinated. My father flew down for that demonstration. And this is the funeral at Morehouse College. I went with my mother and my father. Mrs. King asked my father to speak. So I think their friendship was inspiring, but I think that it should be taken by us as Jews not simply as something to be proud of, and I know a lot of Jews feel very proud that my father and many other rabbis and many other Jews were involved in the civil rights movement, put their lives on the line. Some were killed, some were beaten. We're proud of that, and that's good. But I don't think actually these pictures should be a source of pride. I think they should be a challenge. And I'm sure my father would have felt that way. A challenge to us And I hope we take it in that spirit. Thanks.
Some questions?
Sure, questions?
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, we talked today about somebody, I forget who now, who could have been embittered and wasn't.
Dr. King?
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, I will. I'll repeat the question.
And this summer, my son and I were on the West Bank, and we visited a Palestinian guy who knows. And this man, Ziad, was a teenager when the first Intifada started. And he saw that there were some kids throwing rocks, so he didn't quite know what was going on. But so, he threw some rocks, and he ended up in an Israeli prison for 10 years, where he was partly mistreated. And you would think that he'd come out bitter, but he became a peace activist. And he and the Jewish guy named Phil Saunders have a group.
I think not everybody can hear you. So I'm going to just summarize and say that Shira met somebody, a Palestinian, who had been imprisoned in Israel for 10 years, but who came out not embittered by this, but became a peace activist. And I think that's quite extraordinary. Yes?
The evils that your family and many people in this room have been fighting against for the past 50 years have been systemic evils. They weren't identified with any particular person or any particular moment. Such a moment and such a person is coming together in November. And there is a great reluctance among all religious communities, except a couple, of indulging in what's referred to as partisan politics. And yet, I feel that the religious community, especially our own community, needs to speak out about the seriousness of the moment that's coming to us, and the sooner the better. What, from your work and your family's work, can we learn about how to make sure that comes about?
So what can we do in terms of the politics that we're facing right now in the election in November? There's a lot to say, so and other people want to ask questions. I'm going to be very quick and just say my father supported George McGovern and worked very hard for McGovern. And there were a lot of Jews who said to my father, you shouldn't do this, he's anti-Israel, left-wing politics, same thing that we're hearing today. My father said no. I can tell you also that a friend of mine showed me recently a letter that my father and Elie Wiesel sent to Golda Meir, objecting to an award that they were giving to Ronald Reagan, who was then governor of California. There was a kind of courage that I see was going on in the 60s that we seem to have lost. Elie Wiesel did that in the 60s. I don't think he would have done that in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s. So there are a couple of issues here. One is simply courage, and one is also principles, standing up for principles, and the principles that go beyond our particular conventional needs as Jews. So why George McGovern? Why care about Vietnam? Look, the bottom line is this. We stand before a crossroads as Jews in a way never before. I can't think of another example in Jewish history. It began in the 60s. There was a choice. There was my father and there was Meir Kahane, who started the Jewish Defense League and who eventually started the Kach Party in Israel that was condemned and outlawed by the Knesset in those days as a fascist political party. And it now has become part of the movement and has become mainstream thinking. That doesn't mean we have to abandon. We have to stick to this. And I don't think we're alone, by the way. I actually think we have strong support. But that's it. Either we go with Kahane, and it leads us to Bibi, it leads us to some terrible things we don't have to mention right now, and then it leads us to Trump and so forth, or we go on the other path. We go with principles. We go with what's right. And we know that ultimately, because Dr. King said it, that ultimately the art bends to justice. Ultimately, justice will prevail. The question is, how soon do we want to understand that and stand up for it? And yes, pay a certain price. There's too much to say, but other people want to ask questions. If you want to
No, I have two different questions, but you can just answer one of them. One of them is, I am still I don't think it'll make any difference. One was simply, what do you think changed at the seminary to have Dr. King come to the rabbinic convention to speak? But the other one was I wanted to ask about the moral direction of Germany, and isn't the German government, isn't Germany kind of teaching us about how to respond, maybe not today, but a few years ago, how to respond to racism and anti-Semitism? So you can, whatever.
Yes, I think Angela Merkel is extraordinary. And after the attempted attack on the synagogue in Halle on Yom Kippur, she went to the synagogue in Berlin that very evening to stand there as a demonstration of solidarity. That's amazing. But I have to say, it's also amazing what happened in Pittsburgh, Tree of Life Synagogue. There was an outcry. We can't just enumerate the attacks. We have to also look at the response. But yes, Germany has done a lot. And yes, there's always this, nonetheless, neo-Nazis, et cetera, but there is a voice that's very strong and powerful, and let's hope it stays loud and powerful. Yes, Mike?
So, you went a little easy on us, because you've written in the past that a synagogue should not show these pictures of King and your dad together. They should be prohibited from doing it unless they do the work, which, that hit me.
You do the work. What are you talking about? You want to know who doesn't do the work? I can tell you. I can name places. I've been there.
You've been there. You've been there. So we're starting a racial justice working group, and everyone here in the room is invited to be a part of it. We actually couldn't have our first meeting because we went on the day it was scheduled. We suddenly had to go to the school because there was an incident where an African-American child was hiding under a desk, having a really hard time. And for whatever reason, we don't know all the facts, but his mother was prohibited from being with him and she was arrested. And this was around the corner. We don't know all the details, but we know, we have a hunch that a white family wouldn't be treated that way. So, getting back to the work, if you could, specific things where, we're not right next to the State House, we're not right next to DC, do you have any thoughts on what is the work that this community can be doing in memory of those two giants behind you towards racial justice?
Oh, it's, you and I are involved in that project
Yes.
through Trua.
Yes.
And so I think that that's really something that ought to be distributed and publicized, and we should work on that. I mean, there's the vast numbers of things people can do. And not everybody has to do the same thing because there's so many different dimensions. But I think also, just on a simple level, using one's voice and saying things at certain moments can be incredibly effective. Just to give you an example, William Sloane Coffin, the chaplain at Yale, was a wonderful friend of my father's and full of energy, just would light up a room. And he once was talking about nuclear disarmament. And he said, one thing you can do is you're standing at a bus stop and, you're reading the newspaper and there's some other people standing there, and you can simply say something like, really? We have enough bombs now that we could blow up the entire Earth 20 times over? I wonder, why do we have to do it 20 times over? Or some little line like that, some little thing, you just drop hints here and there. Just plant a little seed. That's the smallest little thing one can do, but even that little seed can grow. Just an example.
Time for one more question.
Sal.
Thank you very much for coming. And but I just want you to know, I because I had seen King
Oh,
speak
you forgot.
live 2 times. Once when he came to our college, and then when Harry Belafonte did a fundraiser for him
Wow.
4 months before he was assassinated.
Where was this
Where the college or the
college?
Lincoln University, Pennsylvania?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and then I thought Malcolm X was the best. He was the most powerful was Malcolm X. But King was eloquent, and the white press bought into it, and that's what made him. But given that, and it's been a process for me not knowing about your dad that much then because it wasn't part of what I was learning. Anyway, we're very lucky here at the CBE to have just recently had our 18th annual Martin Luther King breakfast. Just wanted to share that with you. That it's we are in some ways alive and well.
Thanks to
That's
you.
great. That's great.
So thank you.
I just want to mention, by the way, in connection with that, James Baldwin, there's some YouTube videos of James Baldwin being interviewed by different people and debating with William Buckley and in England and so forth. Anyway, what's so striking to me in those days is how Baldwin would be asked, but look how well the Jews are doing, why can't you people do that? Things like that. In other words, I think it's important for us to know in this discussion of Black-Jewish relations how Jews were invoked in a very hostile way over and over again with Baldwin, and also, by the way, with King and the whole communist thing, which was a cover for Jewish, communist Jewish, very similar. So that's an element of the story of the history of Black-Jewish relations that I think gets neglected when people ask why the resentment. Can I just mention one other thing?
Please.
I just read 2 books about Israel, Palestine, and the African American community. One book wasn't so good, by Michael Fishbach. It's sort of a harangue. The other book was brilliant, by Keith Feldman, called The Shadow Over Palestine. And it's brilliant, it's just dazzlingly brilliant. Again, what it left me, both books left me asking, was why always the identification in the 1960s by certain civil rights leaders with Palestine almost exclusively and with such forcefulness, as opposed to, or let's say, at the same time omitting identification with the Caribbean, with Latin America, with South America, with the Philippines, with other places where the United States was doing mischief and involved militarily, financially, and so forth. Why is that? And I think those books are worth reading, especially the Keith Feldman book. It leaves me asking, but I think that the history of Black-Jewish relations has been distorted by many people and many historians, and deserves another examination. People like to evoke my father, Dr. King, and then sometimes I hear from Jews after, and this is very racist, they'll come up to me and say, look what we did for them. After all we did for them, that kind of thing. It's important for us to be able to respond and have some history of what actually the complications going on. And when I watched the Baldwin videos on YouTube, I was especially struck by that. How obnoxious can that be to have someone say to him, why can't you be like the Jews? Yeah? And too often in the Jewish world, Jews will say that kind of thing. So we need to understand how we fit into the politics of racism in this country and how we are manipulating in our history.
We can pass for white.
Well, of course, but to reduce things to that is very problematic.
Yes, thank you.
So I thank you all.